Bueno, pues nada, hoy tenemos con gran honor a una de las personas que seguramente más nos ha inspirado y cuyos diseños más nos han influido. Estamos con el gran Roger Linn, una de las personas que digamos, ha diseñado algunos de los aparatos más icónicos de los últimos 30, 40 años. Así que, bueno, vamos a tener primero una pequeña entrevista, un poco para ver un poco su bagaje, cómo han ido las cosas, y acabaremos hablando de su último instrumento, el Linnstrument, que, bueno, ya veréis que es un dispositivo muy expresivo. So, let's start. Thank you, thank you, Roger, for being here. It's a very pleasure for having you here.
Thank you.
And let's start with the beginning.
Okay.
Let's start with the Linndrum. Is that the beginning, or there was something before the Linndrum?
Well, the first drum machine I made was called the LM-1 drum computer. And that's what Prince used and a lot of the people in the early 80s.
Okay, so how was at that times when digital components were so expensive to put all these things on the Linndrum?
Actually, there were no digital companies back then. I was the first to do it for drums, and the other company was Fairlight, and everyone else was analog. And so it was very early days for digital. But it was exciting, and
everything was new.
Everything was new, exactly, yeah. And so, and I was lucky. A lot of people used it on popular records, like I say, Prince, Peter Gabriel, Madonna, Michael Jackson. Human League, yes, yeah, and many of the English bands. So it was an exciting time to see it, to hear it on recordings.
So your intention was to create a rhythm machine able to replace a real drum, or in some way?
I think that's probably too high an ambition. It was just to create more. I was originally thinking more of a songwriting tool, and to be used on recordings as best I could. But it surprised me how many people used it on recordings. And I wanted to make it sound as human as possible, but many people, I think, wanted to make it sound as inhuman as possible. And a more robotic beat was popular at the time. So you can never tell. You make an instrument and then people use it as they will use it.
How tight was the Linndrum in terms of being so straight? It was a mechanical rhythm machine, or it has some, some nuances on playing?
Well, there's two things that I invented that helped make it sound more natural. Well, first of all, I created a timing corrector, quantized it's called, and I created swing, and those help to make it make what you programmed in sound more natural when they play back. And I also put multiple buttons. My first machine had no touch-sensitive pads, so I would have one button for the soft, one button for the loud, one button for the very loud, for example. And so people could program dynamics and volumes in that way.
It was a smart investment by that time, I think.
Yeah, it was probably the best. It was the best I could do. Of course, the problem is that most people didn't use the dynamics at all. Most of the beats they created sounded like and were very robotic, but that's what they choose to do.
Well, it was fun at the time.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
And also, how the programming EPROMs, which became popular by that time, it was compared to today's standards. It's like, but by that time was very inspiring too, I think.
Yeah, and expensive. So my idea was that there was digital tape recording at the time, but no one did anything where they would store the sound in computer memories. And I thought, for drums, if I could just store a very short bass drum and a very short snare drum and a very short hi-hat and maybe tom-toms or some other drums, that would total very little memory, and so it wouldn't be so expensive. And so my first drum machine was still expensive. It was $5,000.
Not bad.
But still, it was able to do that, and it became a very useful tool because people like to have beats that sounded more realistic, you know, and to be able to program those beats.
Did you use some tricks like looping the samples and using PCAs to create a natural decay on
Mostly no. The only thing I had to do was I had to loop the sample of the hi-hat because it was too long to fit in the memory. And so I had a drummer take mallets and do roll, and then I would just use an envelope generator to either do a little bit of that or more, you know, decay on it. Excuse me. But we were all figuring it out then. We didn't really know what was the right method.
I think many people, including myself, will pay for being on the recording sessions of the samples for the Linndrums, because it was like we're making history. You maybe don't know, we're not conscious about that, but it's like, just imagine about that.
Well, yeah, I mean, the session consisted of me putting a microphone over a snare drum in my closet of my house, so it was pretty simple. But it was funny after a while, because once I started to make more samples, then I would go to a studio, and so I did a session once with a drummer named Stan Lynch, who played drums in Tom Petty's band, the Heartbreakers. And so he was out in the studio, and I was in the control room, and he tuned his drum, and he got it to sound good, and we set up the microphones. And then I said, "Stan, could you hit the drum?" And he goes, "Poof." I said, "Thank you very much, Stan. It was very good."
You talk about how you develop the swing. I remember something like maybe 3 or 4 years ago, an article written by you explaining how did you develop that swing. That I recommend everybody to Google it too, because it's very, very interesting. And that swing, it's also very important on the MPC from Akai. You started to work for Akai.
Yes.
And you reinvented everything one more time.
Oh, thank you.
Because there was no more EPROMs and this painful processing.
Yeah.
It was an instant sampling machine.
Yeah, yeah.
And you, in some way, your devices created new genre, new styles like hip hop or these urban things.
I got lucky, yeah.
How you remember these times?
Well, it was very exciting. Actually, the first machine I made with sample was my product from my company, the Linn 9000, and that was in 1984. But it was too expensive and too complex, and it was unreliable. And so it was nice to work with Akai because they made it more reliable. But in the swing, I think I know the article you're talking about, where the interviewer was asking me, what are all the secret tricks you did to make the swing sound so good? And there were no secret tricks. Swing is remarkably dumb, easy to do. You just delay every alternate 16th note, and then it's just a matter of how much you delay it. But all the DAWs have managed to make it turn something that's very simple into something way, way too complex. They have these groove templates that are ridiculously complex and hard to use. Definitely. And all they need is a little knob where you can adjust the amount of swing, and that's it.
Simple, and it works.
Yeah, it works, but they need to make it more complex. You know, I'm sure
more human.
Well, yeah, right. But I'm sure there was someone in marketing that says we need something. We need a term. How about groove templates? Okay, it'll be a new feature. But it's remarkably easy, and it's just a matter of dialing in the right amount of swing. And it has to be different for different tempos, and it depends on the music you're doing with it, the style you want to do. But it's just a matter of that, just how much of a delay of every alternate 16th note.
You are very famous because being behind the designs of some iconic drum machines or samples, but you also has been focused into the guitar market with the Adrenalinn.
Yeah.
And I remember that something like 10, 12, 15 years ago, when amp modeling was becoming popular. How do you decide to switch to the guitar market?
Oh, I just try to do things that are fun. And I've done a number of drum machines, and so I can design drum machines in my sleep. But I want to do something different, and I was a guitar player. And the idea of Adrenalinn had to do with my love for...
It was not the typical modeling box. It was a little bit more with some special effects.
Well, what it is it's the title of it is beat-synced multi-effects. And the idea for Adrenalinn came for when I was a teenager, and I used to use modular synthesizers. And I was a guitar player, so instead of playing synthesizer parts with keyboard, I like to run recorded audio through the modular synthesizer, through the filters, through the amplitude processing, through the various ways that it processed the signal. But what I like to do was to, for example, play guitar and then have a looping step sequencer alternate between different filter frequencies. And so the main idea of Linnstrument is to have in software a large number of synthesizer modules like that, but to make them very easy, you can just change it with a preset. So the guitar players, which are very impatient people, can just turn a knob and get the sound. And so the idea is that you could just play your guitar and you'd hear this looping 32-step sequence of filter tones or flanger tones or beat sync delay, but all together into one, along with limiting so that the peaks wouldn't be too loud, and just dial it up. And so, and I've sold about 12,000 of them, so there's a good market of it. Yeah.
How is the second-hand market for the Adrenalinn?
It's actually pretty good. They tend to hold their value very well. So it has sort of
because
a cult following.
This kind of products that 20 or 30 years after it was discontinued becomes popular, trendy, and everybody wants and pay thousands of euros for that.
Yeah.
And okay, we have your new baby here, the Linnstrument. It looks like a very expressive kind of instrument controller. What's really the Linnstrument?
Well, it's pretty simple. There's two main points about it. Number one is it is expressive, and what I mean by that is that instead of having a bunch of on-off switches like a MIDI keyboard, it responds continuously to 3 dimensions of control, and that's pressure, pitch, left, right, with pitch correction, and in the 3rd dimension, whatever you assign it to, but usually it alters the tone of the waveform. So this particular sound is a very simple synthesizer sound, a pulse wave and a filter, nothing else, no VCA, no envelope generators, no LFOs, just a pulse oscillator and a filter. So the pressure is changing the filter frequency. Left-right movement is changing the pitch. And then forward-back movement is the pulse width modulation. And that's fully polyphonic. And so I can apply that to any sound.
Not so many instruments are this way of expressive.
Yeah, it's a new revolution. There are only 5 instruments. It's the Linnstrument, it's the Rolly Seaboard, it's the Continuum by Hawken Audio, and a couple of others. And it's we're all in the same revolution, and that is to rid the music world of on-off switches. Like a MIDI keyboard, it's just a bunch of on-off switches. Drum machines are just a bunch of on-off switches. And that's okay. People make good music with it. The only problem is that the music that is made with all these on-off switches tends to be used for background music. So for example, in popular songs, electronically generated popular songs, there are no more instrumental solos. Or people are doing DJ work, and they're brilliant DJs, but they're all being used for background for dance. And in film or TV work, there's some wonderful scores being done, but it's the background for picture. And my opinion is that in order to be the foreground, the center of attention, you need to do something between the on and off of the note. And that's what the human voice does. And in popular recordings, the singers are wonderful. They have this wonderful expression over the course of each note.
We are black or white, but sometimes we forgot about the grease in between.
Well, it's the problem with it is if you're just turning a sound on and turning it off, you can have things like envelope generators that will change it over the course of the note, but it'll change it exactly the same way each note. And you have things like a pitch bend wheel, but they don't really work, or a mod wheel, and they don't really work. And so the idea of this is to get it closer to the human voice, or to allow the expression of fine acoustic instruments, but not for old music, but to be able to apply those same ideas of expression to new music. Right?
With the addition that you can assign all the coordinates to whatever parameter you want.
Yeah, exactly.
You mentioned about other companies like Rolly or even Roland working on similar...
Well, not Roland, but Rolly.
Oh, on similar kind of
expressive controllers.
Controller. I think there was some plans for adding some new specification to the MIDI protocol, including all this additional expressiveness. What's the situation? What's the current situation?
Oh, it's a new standard, and it's not really a change to MIDI. It's just a clear definition of how to use MIDI a little differently. One of the problems with MIDI is if you want to do simultaneous pitch bends like this, you can't do it because over one MIDI channel there's only one pitch bend message. So all this new thing is, which is called MPE, or MIDI polyphonic expression, is that each note is sent over its own MIDI channel, rotating through the channels. So if I play this note, it's sent with all its movements on MIDI channel 1. This one is sent on MIDI channel 2. This one's sent on MIDI channel 3. So all three dimensions for each note get their own MIDI channel. And there's so far about 80 different synthesizers that support MPE, but all it means is that you have to have a synthesizer that has, each voice responds on a different channel, and there's already a bunch of them that do that anyway. Multi-timbral synths.
Do you think this current vintage synth addiction is in some way is not allowing the development of these new expression techniques, for example, all this cult of vintage machine from Roland, or
what is vintage? Do you say?
Vintage,
like, vintage. Yeah, okay.
Classical Roland or Korg or even R machines that are very popular about that, but these days, but limited on this on-off binary situation, is in some way avoiding this advance into this more expressive.
Well, actually, what's interesting is the people that are most interested in this tend to be the Eurorack players. The synthesizer is not limited. It's just the human interface to the synthesizer. So, for example,
in some ways more easy to make a modular synth more expressive using these things than a typical analog old synth, maybe?
Well, yeah, this sound I was just playing, all this is an oscillator and a filter, nothing more. So if I were to play this on a standard MIDI keyboard, it would sound like this. Right?
Okay.
But instead, so it's still only an oscillator and a filter, but it's the human interface.
Definitely.
And so, and I'm not making any criticism of the current state of the art. I'm just saying that I think that there are some very talented people, but their talent can't be fully realized because the human interface for music is so poor. And so what we're all trying to do is give people a better paintbrush. Yeah. Well, we're making a better paintbrush so the artist can paint better paintings. You know.
Right. And how difficult or how easy is to set up the Linnstrument to perform the way you want? Because I see what I can see is quite simple. The interface, just a few buttons, some letters, and the grid for keys. How you can set up easily to?
Well, first of all, you just connect via USB to your computer or to your converter on your Eurorack system for MIDI to CV, and then you don't have to change anything. Right out of the box, it works just like connecting a MIDI modular keyboard. But the other thing I should explain, earlier I was saying there's two things that are unique about that. One is the expressive capability to respond to 3 dimensions, and it also does velocity and release velocity. But the second thing is the obvious thing when you look at it. Doesn't have its notes arranged like a piano keyboard. Instead, it's kind of like a big guitar or bass or any stringed instrument.
Okay.
So each one of these rows is kind of like a string. And the lights just tell you where the major scale is, like the white keys on a piano. Blue is C. And then the different rows can be tuned however you want, just like a stringed instrument can be tuned. So the normal way of tuning it is what's called fourths tuning, which is every 5 semitones. So this note is the same as this note, same as this note, just like on a stringed instrument. And so if I want to do a major scale, for example, so it's pretty straightforward. So those two main things are expressive control and a new interface of notes. Now the reason for that new interface is that my good friends at Rolly, they have the C board, but the trouble with that is it's very difficult to do these sort of pitch gestures like.
I can imagine in a performance scenario that you get nervous, you know, and sometimes.
Well, the problem with it is that on a piano keyboard, it's great for playing piano music, but the notes are not evenly spaced, and the black keys are behind the white keys. So depending on what key you're playing in, you're either bending this way or that way, or kind of a squiggly motion. It's very poor at doing these expressive gestures, whereas a stringed instrument doesn't have any of those problems. And by the way, this is not my idea or happens alone on Linnstrument. This is the standard note interface in Ableton Push. This is also the standard interface in Rolly's blocks.
Yeah, definitely.
And it's also the standard interface in iPad apps like the GeoShred, and there's a few other hardware controllers too. So it's fast becoming the new interface for playing notes for synthesis.
I agree. It's funny because many customers, when you show them push and all this way of putting the notes, at the beginning, yeah, it's cool, but I prefer my keyboard. It's very difficult to combine them, that try to use and let them go just playing, because sometimes musicians are a little bit conservative. You know?
Yeah, sure, yeah.
But many others, after trying, we will say, yes, spend a couple of afternoons playing that way, and let's talk. And no, it's fun because you get to some conclusions that using a traditional keyboard you never arrive.
Yeah, sure, yeah.
And that for me, increasing the creativity in these new ways is very positive always.
Yeah. And we'll say one thing too. You know, this really is only for people who play notes. You know, for example, there are a lot of DJs that make wonderful music just by combining loops and sequences and beats, but don't really play notes. And for them, this really has no purpose. It's really if someone wants to play notes like bass lines or melody lines, and it can do beats too, but if you're not doing any sort of bass notes or melody lines, something like that, it really has no advantage for it.
Do you think visual artists could also be interested into the Linnstrument?
I'm going to say again?
Visual artists, VJs.
Yeah.
Could be also interested. Do you think there is a market for visual artists using the Linnstrument to add in more creative expressivity for launching and manipulating their visuals? What do you think?
For beats, you said?
For VJs, visual DJs.
Visual? Oh,
DJs.
Virtual. Okay, yes, I'm sorry.
Like just manipulating visual material on real time, or
sure. Yeah, you know, it depends. For example, you're doing bass parts. Let's say you had a bass sound here, like this one. Well, this is a sample sound. It's a fretless bass. So all those sort of slide gestures allow you to work. And now you can do this in rhythmic material. And the other thing I think is kind of interesting is this expressive three-dimensional control does some very exciting things for beats, too. So I could show you a little bit of that. So here's a sound. Now, you know, one of the other things that I introduced in 1984 with my Linn 9000 product was the idea of the pressure-sensitive roll button, which I called a note repeat. So I've got an automatic playing, and that's using the internal arpeggiator feature of the Linnstrument. So I can just vary that pressure, and everyone's familiar with that. But I sort of have note repeat on steroids, because if I tilt my finger to the left or to the right, I change the pitch, or even slide it further. And then if I tilt my finger forward, it changes to a pressure-controlled filter. So natural, pressure-controlled filter. And then if I want to change the repeat rate, I can just use this little yellow row at the bottom, so I can do it in real time.
And just with 2 fingers.
Yeah. And I can do that with as many fingers as I want. Completely independent. So for example, if I want to create a beat with one hand, I've got 3 fingers. And now I've got that hand doing that. I can use this one for bass.
You have set up the arpeggiator for the both parts, and you can use only an arpeggiator in one part and the other just playing freely, or?
Yeah, I have it set independently for each of the 2 keyboard splits. This is the left split, the right split, and then I can just change the proportion between the 2 like that. And then the low row here, I had to assign this to change the arpeggiator rate. So I was going between, it says 16th swing, here's 16th note triplets, 32nd notes, 32nd triplets, all the way down to 8th note triplets or 8th notes. So, and that right now, the default, I have it set right now, is going to 16th half swing. That's why it has kind of a loose feel. Like that. So. And there was nothing I was doing, was playing a beat back. I was playing it all live. So it's very creative in that regard. You could actually play beats live with one hand.
Definitely, definitely.
Would you like to hear some other sounds?
Please.
Okay. So here, for example, is, here's the arpeggiator on an electric piano sound. So let's just actually, I'll play a beat here. And I'll play electric piano sound. Let's see, here's some, or if I take the arpeggiator, if I can just play chords, you know. One of the advantages of this string layout, unlike a piano, the people watching may be aware that on a piano, if you want to play a simple major scale or major chord, you have to learn one fingering for C, a different fingering for C sharp, another one for D, another for D sharp. But this is, by comparison, it's isomorphic. So one scale is the same fingering no matter what key I play in. So it's 12 times easier to learn. So people say that they learn it very quickly. So here's some other ones. Here's a guitar sound. Or a different one. Blues harmonica. Or here's a pedal steel guitar.
I never thought that a sampler instrument could sound this way.
Yeah, it's true. Well, it's all in the way you're playing it. So that's the reason for the 3 dimensions. Here's upright bass. Or here's some other synths. Here's, this is an interesting one. Here's kind of like a dulcimer sound. And in this case, the sound of the hammered string is open if I move forward, and it's more muted, like with the palm of the hand if I go backward. Or here's another synthesizer sound. In this case, I have 2 oscillators that go more out of tune with each other as you move your finger forward. A traditional sound. This is violin. Or here's a saxophone. So it makes just about any sound because once you've got those 3 dimensions control, you can emulate any of those instruments. I mean, it does take some practice, but it's a whole lot easier than holding a violin between your chin and your neck with the notes that far apart. You know?
So cool. So, what's next?
Well, I don't know. This is actually, I think what's next is, what I'm hoping is next is that people will continue to be using this and other instruments like the seaboard or the continuum or some others to follow. And that I'm hoping that what we will do is allow musicians to step out from the background onto the front of the stage and allow them to have, and I hope to see a whole new generation of solo instrumentalists that are the modern day equivalents of the Jimi Hendrix or the Stephen Grappelli or the Miles Davis or any of the great solo acoustic instrument soloists of the years past, but the equivalent with modern sounds and synthesis. You know.
Well,
that's what we're trying to do.
It's good because something like the the last new thing into creating music in some ways, the finger drumming,
yeah,
becoming quite popular.
Yeah.
And it's something new. That's something like 30, 40 years ago was not exciting.
Exactly, yeah.
So it's something new. And maybe all these finger drumming artists, if they take a look into these three-dimensional new instruments, maybe we can see in a few months or years something completely fresh and
well, everything I've ever done has always met initial resistance, and then it ends up being popular in the long run because people get it and they say, you know, I didn't think that something like this would be good, but now that I use it, I see how powerful it is. And so it has an acceptance that sometimes they call an inverted bell curve. It looks like this. There's a certain peak at first, and then it slows down, and then it gradually, as the people find out how useful it is, it grows. And so far I've sold about 1,500 of these. And, but right now it's just to the futurists, the people who are the early adopters. And it's starting to filter out into people who they tell their friends, they tell other friends and such. And it's an exciting time because I feel like what we're all doing, the people who are making these machines, is we're having a positive impact on music and by giving musicians a better tool, you know. So that's exciting enough.
Definitely. Let's see what happens in the next year.
Yeah.
But for sure it's going to be very, very exciting.
Yeah.
Thank you, Roger, for your time.
You're very welcome.
You're welcome too. You have a family here. And thank you everybody watching this interview, workshop, whatever. And see you next time. Nos vemos en la próxima. Muchas gracias.